the person that I know the best in the world is myself. And so I know I'll find interesting insight there. Yeah, it's like if I made a film about like straight people, like I don't actually know what I would want to say about it, but I have a lot of opinions about being gay, you know, and like being Asian American. That is like, you know, somewhat unique, right? And I think what I find kind of motivating in filmmaking is that like you can use this art form to like shine a light on something that people overlook, you know. I agree with you that you know, Asian cultures, I mean specifically like Korean culture, it's not always the most like happy, you know, to kind of air out your dirty laundry. And you know, I was just telling Walter at dinner that you know, I had some people, like Korean people from the community in LA say like, why would you depict our community this way? You know, as like struggling, you know. And part of that's like a reaction to how, you know, like I found it so frustrating as a kid that like my mom would show me like articles from the Korean newspaper about like people's kids getting into Harvard. And I just was like, I hate that like this is the story that's being, you know, promoted, you know, and just thinking kind of more, you know, like big picture. I just was like, you know, like the American dream narrative, I just like was like not interested in that specific story. I wanted to kind of talk about how like it's really difficult. You know, my parents at one point in their lives like owned a sushi restaurant that kind of like fucked us over, you know. And so, you know, like I think I'm very fortunate that my family has been very cool with it, you know. And I think it's because I treat my characters with like a sense of respect and not like an exploitation. And I think it's that like filmmaking philosophy that allows me to kind of, yeah, just like not have to worry about, you know, the kind of crisis that you're describing.
That's great. That's really good to hear. I was very curious just because I feel like that's what the experience tends to be. Your work spans such different tones. What draws you toward telling a story as a comedy versus a drama, and how do you navigate those tonal shifts as a director?
Yeah. I mean, I think that like humor is a big part of every day, you know. It's like people laugh, I like to watch comedies, you know. And so even though I didn't start my career making comedies, it was something that I was really interested in. I think comedies are so hard. They're harder than making a drama. I hate making comedies. They're like impossibly difficult because everybody has a different sense of humor, and you know, and it's like an incredibly precise art form. Like there's something about rhythm and intonation. There was a joke in Fire Island that never worked in test screenings, and then my editor like increased the volume on 2 syllables of a word, and then suddenly people were laughing. And that's crazy. Like it's kind of magical. Like you kind of don't understand it. But yeah, you know, like I think for me, like especially when dealing with like love and relationships, I think there's so much absurdity to them, you know. And so in Fire Island and in Wedding Banquet, which is talking about love and relationships, I think it's like fun to like lean into the comedy. You know, the other kind of element of this is that you know, it's like I want to make queer and Asian films, and it's really difficult to make like a queer and Asian drama with like a certain kind of like resource level, you know, like a budget. And the best way that I could do it is to make rom-coms and cast Bo and Yang, you know? And so like there's a certain just like reality, like if Fire Island was a drama, it would be half the budget, you know? It's just kind of the nature of the marketplace. And so, yeah, it's a combination of forces that I kind of have to like look at each film holistically and be like, what does the story want to be, and how can I make this story?
We have a really great question from Sophie. Sophie, go ahead.
Hi.
Hi, Andrew. I love Spa Night so much. I've never seen it before, and it was just so heartfelt and incredible. Something I really liked about it was like how quiet of a movie it was. Like there's no real like music until the very end, and the sound design is just so like, I don't know, it's just so real. It's very like, it just fills out the movie in such like a comforting, quiet way. What went into the decision to go that route rather than having, you know, music drops throughout?
Yeah, we couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford it. You know, like the budget for Spa Night was under $500,000, which is a lot of money, but for a feature film is actually very little money. And you know, it was a situation where, you know, there was just a restriction. Like we couldn't afford a composer, we couldn't afford to license, you know, music. There is music that you hear in the film, but you know, like that was using basically like easily licensable, like very cheap tracks, and so that was just kind of a reality. What we did at that point then was creatively kind of lean into that and be like, okay, if we're not gonna have music, then how can we make the sound design feel musical? And so like there's like the drip, 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 drip of the sauna, you know, like just kind of how do we have the rest of the film, you know, have a real like expressive sound design. And so we took that really seriously, like worked with a sound designer, like in a very you know, like detailed way. You know, there's the sound of the steam room door opening, and like I think we auditioned like 50 sounds, you know, because we just wanted to find the right one. You know, like the creak of going up the stairs to the area where like the men are hooking up, like, you know, there was so much that was about the experience. And so, you know, in a weird way, I wonder, it's like if we had a bigger budget and we just started to put score everywhere, if we would not have had such beautiful sound design work. But because we did have this restriction, we could kind of really focus on that. So yeah, it's something that I'm very like proud of my sound designer, John Warren, did beautiful work on it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Evelyn.
I wanted to know, I think that like gazing is really important in the queer community, and I wanted to know how you designed the shots to convey yearning from the character.
Yeah. I love that you say yearning, because that actually was a word that my cinematographer and I used a lot. Our kind of like cinematography thesis statement was visual yearning. And we talked about how that idea could manifest in different ways. And, you know, one was like shooting through steam, you know, like shooting through glass, not necessarily being able to see a figure super clearly. Another way was to think about framing and how we would frame things out, and so kind of having an audience want to know what's outside the frame, and so being through much of the film pretty tight. And then I think there was a lot of just workshopping, and so there's the scene in the film where David is mopping, and there are these men kind of looking at each other, and that gaze was something that was so integral to not just the visual aspects of the film, but the story. This is how David figures it out, is that he sees people looking at each other, and so we actually we shot a version of that scene in a director's lab. So we actually shot and kind of practiced that sequence, edited it so that when it came time to shooting it for the feature, we felt ready. But yeah, it was there was something about the spa itself and that story, where we knew that kind of looking would be so important, and so my cinematographer and I went to those spas and shot listed together. It was very funny, shot listing naked. We were just it was. I'm sure people were what are they doing? Because we're in the spa going like this. But yeah, it's something that the film is so kind of location inspired, and I think that it kind of holistically led us to kind of gaze and visual yearning, so that the film feels very organic, holistic.
Thank you.
I want to throw back to the moderators for a question.
When you're drawing from real, personal, cultural experiences to create comedy, how do you stay honest and vulnerable without letting culture become the punchline?
Good question. I think in Spa Night, there's the first birthday ceremony, and there was something about that, baby's first birthday, that there's a little humor there that I thought was really, it just felt kind of realistic. I think I was trying to show something that kind of grew organically out of the situations. And then for those of you who've seen the wedding banquet, there's a Korean wedding ceremony, and again, I think that the humor there is kind of grown out of just the modern a modern audience, modern participants practicing a traditional ritual, and so for me the Korean wedding ceremony is very hetero, and so as a queer person, how would I practice that? And so that's kind of where the humor grew out of. It wasn't necessarily driven by I need a laugh, I need exploitation. It was more how is this actually really weird and strange and maybe funny, by just the fact that we're practicing this, even though it might not have been meant for us. And so yeah, I think you've all heard me say like the words like organic and holistic a lot. Like for me, it's like I think you can avoid certain like exploitation or like, you know, abuse, you know, by like just drawing inspiration from what's happening, you know, and being respectful of like, oh, here's this thing that's inspiring to me, like what grows out of this organically, as opposed to like imposing, like I need a laugh right here, you know. And so I think that's the way that I've tried to like navigate that.
I want to squeeze in something really quick. The moment that this movie, when I was first watching it, really breathed for me was when this is a little throwaway scene where the grandmother's sitting on the floor in the living room cooking, you know, like peeling, I think, something. My grandmother used to do that all the time. I've never seen that in a movie before. That really sort of very specific, personal, I thought, cultural memory. So, I mean, is something like that in your movies, is it scripted? Is it something that, or was she just doing that one day and you just said we should put this in here?
That was scripted. That was scripted. Yeah, you know, I mean, like fruit cutting for me, it's like it's so Korean, you know, or it's like it's very my parents, you know, and our actress like playing the mother was like super, like when I asked her, like, oh, like, are you able to peel this pear? And she was like, oh, can I? And she like peeled it in one script, and she was like super proud, you know. Yeah, like I think some of those details are in the script, and then some of those details are discoveries, and you know, there is a lot of like personalization that I love for the actors to do. So like in Spa Night, the main character, David, in the screenplay spoke a lot more English, just because that's the kind of balance of English and Korean that I speak with my parents. But then the actor that we cast, Jo Suh, his Korean is better than mine, and he naturally wanted to speak more Korean. And it made sense, you know, like I liked that. And so, you know, we adjusted that. And I think it gives the film a different texture, and one that feels more organic, as opposed to something that like I was going to like impose on him, you know. So yeah, so I think as a filmmaker, often what I'm trying to do is, you know, with the elements in place, like find that authenticity. And, you know, like with that actor, his authenticity was to speak more Korean, and I you know, instead of fighting that, I encouraged it.
Great question. Emily?
Yeah, I was listening. First time I've ever seen Spa Nights. It was so beautiful and heartfelt and full of yearning, and just in a way that like the longer you look at something, the more it changes before your eyes. And I thought that was really so powerful. And what really stood out to me was the way it's cut is just so, it feels so purposeful. And I was wondering if those, like, you found these human moments on set and you knew it as soon as you saw it and it was like, yep, we got it, let's move on, or if you like had to really search for it in the cut, and how, if it came together, like which space, and like kind of how you talked to your actors about that. Like how do you, it feels so personal. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think it's very kind of scene by scene. There were certain scenes where it was very obvious to me on set, you know, what we needed and how it was going to come together in the edit. You know, so that scene that I mentioned earlier where like David's mopping, like that was not like storyboarded, but it was very clearly planned. And then there were other scenes where, you know, my cinematographer and I had a shot list, and we had a strategy, but, you know, we wanted to kind of leave things open, and so as a director, I'm trying to get, you know, it's like options, you know, like working with my actors, you know, is there a version of this, you know, like there's a moment where David's parents fight, and his dad stumbles out, and his mom is like, oh, like, go follow him, make sure he doesn't drive, and we have so many different options of my actor Joe's reaction, because we just weren't sure exactly what we want to say about how that character's feeling in this moment, kind of witnessing that argument. But yeah, it's interesting in the edit. Certain things were very clear, and then other things we really had to like massage and figure out. One thing that we realized was that in the early cuts of Spa Night, David starts working at the spa really late in the film, like almost past the halfway mark. And my editor and I were like, oh, like, he should get this job sooner, like, we need to pull this up. And so there's actually a lot more kind of at the beginning of the movie before he, like, gets that job. And we, like, kind of compressed it all so that he could get the job kind of by the end of the first act. And then there are scenes that, like, I thought, I remember watching a cut of a scene, and I, like, didn't think that my editor, like, I was like, oh, I think there's, like, a better version of this. And then my editor, like, went home for, like, a family emergency, and I was kind of left with the cut on my own. And so, like, I was editing, and I re-edited that scene, and then I watched my scene, and then I watched the version that he cut, and I was like, oh, his is better. And so, like, there, in the way that, like, I mentioned, like, discovery, like my actor Joe being able to speak more Korean, like, in the rehearsal process, in the audition process, like, like, using that, there's discovery to be made in the edit as well. And so being open, to seeing, like, even though you might have had a plan for this and you, like, had a very specific vision in mind, that, like, someone else might bring in a different perspective, that, like, once you see it, you're like, oh, actually, like, this works better, And it's kind of constant fine-tuning, especially with features, which are, like, such a beast to edit, Like, with short films, you can kind of watch a short film, like, 5, 6, 7 times as you're editing in the same night. Like, you can't watch a feature 5 times in a row. Like, it just, it takes so long. And so you have to, the feature kind of has to, like, you have to understand it kind of almost like biologically, like in your bones, so that when you work on a small part of it, that you still, like, have the feeling of, like, the other scenes around it. But yeah, like, I really loved learning about kind of that, the joy of discovery in post-production, by working on the feature.
I'm gonna throw it back to Christine.
I feel like in Spa Night there were so many, like, beautiful, like, silent close-ups, and it's just these really, like, controlled shots. And I was wondering, since so much of your work deals in, like, subtle performances, how do you communicate nuance without over-directing actors?
Yeah, I mean, some of that is, like, cast the best actors you can, right? And it's really funny, like, the further I get along in my career and kind of the more experienced the actors I work with, the less work I have to do, Like, when I worked with Hong Chow on Driveways, like, I didn't give her many notes. And people are like, wow, you directed such a beautiful performance from her. And I'm like, it's kind of all her. And in a weird way, like, my biggest job as a director was to convince her to do the movie, But yeah, like, I think we worked really hard to find, these actors in Spa Night. And, like, that main character, we saw a lot of, like young Korean actors to try and, find the right person. And there was something about Joe that just, I didn't have to do much. I mean, there's still directing and there's still, kind of shaping of performances, but like, he felt so kind of at home in the film. And part of that's because he, like, lived in Koreatown, like he just felt like the people that I went to church with, Another thing I'll mention is, part of performance is like is cinematography, and I remember my cinematographer Ki-jin Kim, we had narrowed down the choices for David to 2 actors. One was Joe and one was another actor, and because I'm a filmmaker that loves kind of getting opinions and feedback, I had Ki-jin look at the audition tapes for both of these actors, and he was very astute, and he said that like the choice is yours, Andrew, but if you go with Joe, I'm really inspired to shoot this on tripod, on sticks, steady, locked off frames. But if we go with this other actor, I think I would shoot it handheld, because they had really different energies. And again, when I talk about kind of organic, holistic filmmaking, like that's such a great example of one where it's like my cinematographer was inspired by the actor to like find a choice that like would kind of highlight the actor's performance.
Let's do one last one from the audience, and then we'll wrap up with the moderators. Evan.
How did you come up with the color scheme of the film, especially during production and then with post-production?
Yeah. I'm trying to remember our conversations. A lot of it was really inspired by that spa location, and so the spa that we shot at had that blue neon light, which I really loved, and the idea was to really use that blue neon light to make that spa feel kind of otherworldly, give it a kind of, just like a little bit of like a zing. And so then the idea became for outside of the spa to kind of try and lean into like warmer colors to create like a dynamic, and so like kind of the Koreatown, of like orange like street lights, and like even just like the warmth of like the actor's skin tone. We played that up. Like Joe is not quite that like warm, but we just like warmed it up, gave him like kind of highlighted that in the color correction, and then we cooled things down like in the neon. So that was kind of the major like kind of macro choice, and then I'll say kind of within scenes it was just about trying to capture like a sense of like this kind of like realism and a kind of Koreatown that like felt authentic to us. I'm not one of those filmmakers where like it's like everything in this scene is red and then like everything in this scene is green, and and like red represents passion and green represents envy. Like I'm not that filmmaker. There are other filmmakers who are that filmmaker, and that's great, but yeah, like especially with this film, there was just like, how can we find enough dynamic range and style, but have it still again feel kind of like rooted in a kind of authentic experience.
Cool. All right, Christine and Angela, bring us up.
Alrighty. I think Something that was really lovely to see is just kind of like the family dynamic and like the home dynamic, like representative of the Asian family, like in Spa Night. And I feel like a lot of like Asian families navigate love through like silence or like different love languages than explicit communication. And I was wondering if that cultural dynamic informs the way you depict any like queer desire or longing or conflict in your films.
Wait, say it
Yeah,
one
like-
more time. Say it one more time.
Okay. Many Asian families navigate love through silence rather than explicit communication. Does that cultural dynamic inform the way you depict queer desire, longing, or conflict in your films?
I mean, I'll say specifically with Spa Night, I was creating a character that is incredibly reserved, you know, like, and that was kind of partially inspired by like my experience of like feeling a certain kind of paralysis growing up, where I like felt like I couldn't, you know, like I couldn't be queer because of my family, because of my parents, you know, like very specifically I can say like I remember like kind of coming out to myself and being like, okay, I know I'm gay, but I hadn't come out to anybody else. And I was like, I want to tell my family first because I don't want them to like find out from like someone else or hear it, like, you know. But I like couldn't muster up the courage to come out to them, and so I just didn't come out for a long time, you know. And then I ultimately ended up coming out to friends, which was great because, you know, that kind of builds your confidence and your sense of identity so that you can come out to, you know, so that I could eventually come out to my parents. But yeah, so like there was just like a restraint in the character that I was really interested in articulating. And so that silence that you see is kind of permeating like all aspects of his life, like his relationship to his parents, his relationship to exploring his queer identity, you know, his queer desire. You know, I don't know if that's always going to be the case. I'm kind of curious. But I wonder if with other characters, with other human beings, that might not always be true. But I think, you know, at least in Spa Night, like I think that is, and I think it's because of this like particular experience and insight that I had that inspired the formation of that character.
Angela?
So as like an indie filmmaker, like prod design is really important. How do you decide like what visual elements are essential and where to compromise, what to change without like hurting the story?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, like our production designer, Han Ki, you know, she's Korean and really understood Koreatown. We worked really hard to kind of create this like, you know, environment for these characters to live in, that you saw different aspects of, you know, where they exist, like from the Korean church to the spa to the restaurant, you know, like the golf driving range. You know, I'll say that like, you know, your question about like how do you choose, like the golf driving range was really important to me because that's something that like I did with my dad, and it was kind of, I wanted a moment to really see like father and son, and that was an activity that felt very like that is just so father and son for me. And so our producers went to the Koreatown golf driving range and asked them if we could shoot there, and they said, yeah, it's gonna be like $20,000 an hour. And we're like, oh, like we can't do that. And so then my cinematographer and I were like walking around, and we were like, hey, like this golf driving range is on top of a parking garage. What if we just reset the scene to happen in the parking garage, and then we could just like really long lens them golfing, you know, and then cut to them like in the car. And so instead of paying, you know, $80,000, we paid $12 in parking, and like, you know, stole the shot, you know, guerrilla filmmaking. But in a weird way, like that actually kind of made the scene better because the intimacy of the car, you know, it used to be that conversation that the father and son have took place like while they were golfing. Yeah, like again, it was one of those things where like both the restrictions and our inspiration kind of led us to something that felt kind of the most organic and the most kind of authentic. And so, you know, for me, like what I try and practice as a filmmaker is like, you know, how can you like look at every situation as an opportunity? How can you really like inspire your collaborators so that they can inspire you? How can you, you know, like find solutions that make sense for your story, so that, you know, like it all seems intentional as opposed to, you know, like accidental or, you know, like random.
Big round of applause for our moderators. We'll hang out tonight for a few more minutes, and then tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock, we'll be here. Have more questions if you want. And Andrew's going to bring script pages. We'll watch some clips from the movies. Flo's going to bring some of her acting students, and just herself, which is great. And yeah, so we'll have a good time. And yeah, come up and say hi to Andrew. Andrew's amazing. All right, big round of applause. Thanks.
Thank you. I feel well prepared.